Recording. All right, so hi everyone, welcome to our fourth GM of the quarter. So some housekeeping. We have 2 excused and 1 unexcused absences total per quarter, and this covers GMs and committee meetings. Secondly, please fill out this membership roster. It will be linked in Slack later on, but I also have it right now if anyone wants to fill in your information so we can get a good head count. Here we go. And next, I'll pass it on to Ashley, who's going to talk more about the outreach survey.
Oh yeah, so hi guys. Curriculum committee from Outreach is currently working on a mental health presentation. So if you guys could each fill out the survey and the QR code is provided on the right, that would be great. Yeah, it shouldn't take too long. So yeah, please fill that out so that we can present about it for week 7. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks Ashley. So that's it for housekeeping today. I'll turn it over to education.
Yep, so there we go. So yeah, there we go. So this is the recap. So Neha, do you want to start us off?
So just a little recap of what we talked last week, since obviously everything in neuroscience is connected. So it's really important to know like the basics before we go and talk about like more complex stuff. So last week we talked about neurotransmitters and what neurotransmitters are that transmit information between neurons. So they basically target cells called neurons, and they're transmitting signals, and they're basically like the sorry if it's really loud, but they basically are the communication. They help help the neurons communicate in our brain, and they usually come in forms of like small amino acids or neuropeptides. So last week we talked about GABA. So this is like one type of inhibitory neurotransmitter, and it helps stop neurons from becoming overexcited. So it's sometimes known as like a mood modulator because it like helps calm our mood down. We also talked about serotonin, which is a pretty well-known neurotransmitter. And this controls a range of functions in our body like sleep, appetite, digestion. And we talked about how like if you want more serotonin, you can eat like chocolate or go for a run. And it also like mediates pain and pleasure in the body. And there's also dopamine, which is really important for movement, which is why like patients with Parkinson's will the neuron death in their brain leads to there being less dopamine in their brains. So because of that, they'll have like restricted movement and not be able to move as much.
Right. So to start off, we also want to go over some case studies about what could go wrong with all of the neuroanatomy that we're actually going to be covering today. So first, I want to direct your attention to the gentleman on the screen there. His name is Phineas Gage. On a lovely day in 1848, he was actually working as a railroad foreman. And while attempting to pack in some gunpowder for that railroad, he was using the steel rod that he's actually holding in his left hand over there. The gunpowder actually exploded and launched that rod into his face, up through his skull, and just out. And so not only did he survive, but he was actually conscious and was able to like walk to a cart to be taken to the hospital or to the doctor. And so some repercussions, like of course the dude had a rod shoved through his skull. So I mean, obviously there had to be some consequences. And he did develop an infection and was comatose for about 2 weeks. But other than that, he was surprisingly able to get out of his house, like just up and walking after about a month. However, his mental changes were the most important part about his case study. Dr. Harlow, a doctor whose observations account for most of how we know so much about Phineas Gage, his ability to make estimates in size and money was actually reduced around after his accident. And the next time Harlow saw Gage, which was about like a month or so afterwards, he had significant changes to his personality. Before the incident, Gage was energetic, he was motivated, and he was known to be a pleasure to work with. But after his accident, Gage was described as, well, to people that knew him, no longer Gage. He had become this sort of grumpy alcoholic, and his inappropriate behavior forced him to leave his job. Later, we discovered that what actually happened, we were able to reconstruct Gage's skull with neuroimaging techniques. And they determined that his prefrontal cortex was mainly damaged. And a part of that is, I mean, if anybody wants to blow up the chat or unmute, based on what Gage, the mental changes that Gage actually went through, does anybody have any guesses of what the prefrontal cortex does? We'll be covering that later in the presentation, but it helps with emotional processing and rational decision making, which might explain the social inhibition. Yes, decision making, which explains why Gage's changes in personality. You know, he no longer received social inhibition from his prefrontal cortex, and therefore had displayed inappropriate behavior, and therefore was forced to leave his job. And again, while not the happiest of stories, like, you know, Gage couldn't keep up a job after his incident, his change in personality and behavior aligned with theories that, you know, different parts of the brain corresponded to different functions, something that was unheard of relatively in the mid 1800s. Now we're getting to Roger Sperry, who studied split brains for most of his research. Just to introduce, again, we'll be getting into this later in the presentation. The corpus callosum, it functions, it's basically just a large bundle of neurons that connect the two hemispheres of the brain. And Roger Sperry, he devoted a lot of his time towards studying split brains, where the corpus callosum was actually severed. When beginning his research, he noted that the function of people with split brains actually didn't differ as much as those with, us, with brains that were in one piece. And this was pretty strange, considering that the corpus callosum was like quite a large area of brain structure. So when he worked with people with severed corpus callosums, it actually offered really cool results. So I sort of put a diagram. It's actually kind of inaccurate, but that black dot in the center sort of divides which eye is seeing the screen. So the bird on the left, only the left eye would be able to see that, and vice versa. The right eye would be able to see the fish. A note for, I did make a mistake. The things that were flashed on the screen were actually words. So instead of a picture of a bird, you would see the word bird, word fish, etc. And what he would do is that he would flash the word fish on the right side of the screen. He would flash the word bird on the left side of the screen. And he noticed that the participants, when he flashed a word on the right side of the screen, so in this case would be fish, participants were able to recognize that word, and they read that word with the right eye. But when they flashed the word bird on the left side of the screen, participants found that they couldn't remember what the word was. And since he knew at this time that the left side of the brain controlled what was seen by the right side of the brain, hence the right eye, he concluded that the left hemisphere was responsible for comprehending language, since participants saw the word fish with their right eye, and the left hemisphere was able to comprehend that. The right hemisphere, however, looking through things through the left eye, wasn't able to make that association. Sperry performed another similar experiment, only this time, let's say the word apple was flashed on the right side, the car was flashed on the left side. Participants, when given the word the car on the left side of the screen with the left eye, participants were actually asked. Participants were actually asked to draw the object that they saw with their left hand. And the results were pretty crazy here. Participants drew what they saw with their left eye, the car, and which was controlled by the right hemisphere. But again, when flashed the word apple, they could only describe an apple instead of a car, which was drawn. So basically what they were doing was they were able to verbally describe the word apple, which was processed by the left hemisphere of the brain, but they were only able to draw a car with the right hemisphere of the brain, which is, pretty crazy research at the time. And overall, so overall, Sperry concluded that people with severed corpus callosums had two separate brain hemispheres that didn't communicate. And the left hemisphere, which controlled stuff seen by the right eye, was responsible for understanding a language, while the right hemisphere, which controlled stuff seen by the left eye, was able to visually recognize words, but not being able to verbally articulate. Again, some crazy research. This guy got a Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine in 1981, and it still remains to this day one of my favorite case studies. So next slide. And before we wanted to dive into this presentation, I wanted to just give a quick overview of how the brain's organized. With a disclaimer that the lobes of the brain, as we know and love, the frontal, temporal, parietal, occipital, they were named after anatomical divisions of the skull. And so what many people, a really common misconception with how the brain's organized is that, oh, the frontal lobe, I learned that from class, the frontal lobe deals with cognition. Oh, the occipital lobe deals with vision. That is only partly true. These lobes were named after anatomical divisions of the skull, and therefore lumping together functions based off the lobes of the brain is very, very, it's not that accurate as you want to be. So just keep this in mind as we proceed through the presentation. We still know far too little about the brain in order to make those, to lump those lobes together. So just be wary of that. But the rough basics is like, yes, the occipital lobe, it does mainly deal with visual processing. It won't be the only active brain region when we're visually, when we're seeing things and when we're visually processing stuff. But I mean, a lot of it has to do with visual processing. Same thing with the temporal lobe. It deals with more complex sensory processing, such as mainly auditory information. Parietal lobe, it deals with attention, awareness of body and movement in space. And finally, the frontal lobe is involved with cognition and planning. So, next slide.
And now we'll be going more into depth about the brainstem. And the brainstem was one of the first part of the brain that developed. So it's basically a stalk-like part of the brain, and it's what connects the cerebrum that's on top of that little green thing to the spinal cord. And basically you have nerves coming out of the brainstem, and that helps connect basically the entire brain to the spinal cord. And it's very small. It only makes up about 2.5% of the brain's mass, and it's divided up into the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And we'll be going more into depth about the function of each one of these structures. Excellent. So the overall function of the brainstem is basically regulating. So it regulates cardiac and respiratory functions, so heart rate and breathing rate. It helps regulate our body's sleep cycle, so when we wake up and when we go to sleep. And then the midbrain in particular, that's part of vision, hearing, motor control, so involuntary movements. The midbrain plays a really big part in controlling that, as well as arousal. So our attention span, the way something makes us feel. And then the pons, that helps control involuntary actions as well, but also motor control. So eye movement as well as facial expressions. And it also plays a really big role in swallowing and also generating dreams. So the brainstem in general helps regulate our sleep cycle, but the pons specifically plays a role in generating our dreams. And then the medulla, it actually plays a really important role in vomiting, sneezing. So it connects the brain to our mouth and our throat. And it also helps control breathing and heart rate as well as blood pressure.
Yeah, and so now moving on from the brainstem to some of our other deeper brain structures, we're going to start with the hypothalamus, which you can see highlighted in yellow in the diagram over there. And so the hypothalamus is largely involved in just maintaining physiological homeostasis, which is essentially just balancing different bodily processes to make sure nothing is too high or too low in the body. And it's also implicated in drive-related behaviors as well. And so some functions it has, one of the main things it actually does is that it communicates with the pituitary gland, which we'll be talking about shortly. And that will allow the pituitary to then release hormones into the bloodstream. Other functions include regulating temperature, So for example, if you're too cold, it'll make sure to constrict blood vessels and promote shivering. Whereas if you're too hot, it'll do the opposite. It'll dilate vessels and promote sweating. It also is in control of feeding behaviors. So it's in charge of making sure that you're not too full or too hungry. And so it'll be involved with hunger and satiety. There are other secondary functions like being involved in circadian rhythms and urination. And it's also associated with emotions like fear and rage that it gets signals from the limbic system for. And so moving on to our pituitary gland that was mentioned. So essentially, you may know this as the quote unquote master gland, just because it releases a lot of different hormones that affect other glands to release their own hormones. But essentially, what the hypothalamus can do is that it can release these neurotransmitters into the anterior pituitary gland as well as the posterior pituitary gland. And so these are two major divisions of the gland, and each of them has their own hormones that they release. And so just to go over some of them, the anterior pituitary releases growth hormone, which is involved with bodily growth. It also releases adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. And so this will go and stimulate the release of cortisol, which is largely involved in your stress response. There's also luteinizing hormone, LH, and follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and those are involved in gonadotropic and sexual development. You also have TSH released, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, which is largely involved in metabolism. You may know people, or in cases of hyper or hypothyroidism. And finally, the anterior pituitary also releases prolactin, which is involved in milk production. And on the other side of the gland, we have the posterior, which mainly only produces two types of hormones, one of them being vasopressin, also known as antidiuretic hormone. So that's largely involved with the kidneys and just making sure to retain water if you don't have enough. And finally, you have oxytocin, which is involved in uterine contractions and lactation.
So next we have the hippocampus, which is considered part of the limbic system. It's mostly known for the formation of memories as kind of an early storage place for newer long-term memories. The hippocampus is primarily made up of pyramidal cells and is divided into 4 separate regions. Each of these regions receives a signal and sends out an output to the rest of the brain through the entorhinal cortex. The hippocampus also works alongside the amygdala to associate emotions to new memories relating to facts and events in order to reinforce them. Another function of the hippocampus is the processing of spatial memories, which allows us to encode the environment around us and kind of just remember where everything is. So even though the hippocampus is involved in memory, it is believed that it does not store long-term memories. Instead, it is theorized that it acts more like a transfer center and kind of just temporarily stores them instead. A big factor in the process is sleep. While we're sleeping, information circulates in the hippocampus and neurons start to encode information through a process called long-term potentiation.
And now we're going to go more into specifics about the different lobes of the brain. So the frontal lobe, it's probably the one that you probably hear about most common because it's the one that's directly behind the forehead, and it's also the largest lobe in the human brain. And it's the one that's most commonly injured in traumatic brain injury. So like if someone gets into a car accident and you heard that they had a brain injury, most likely it's going to be in the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe, like the other parts of the brain, it's basically made up of 2 paired lobes. And it's divided up into different cortexes that control different activities of the brain. So in the image on the right, it shows there's a premotor cortex, a motor cortex, a prefrontal cortex, and Broca's area. And we'll be going more into depth about what those are. And the frontal lobe was actually the last part of the brain to evolve, which is why it's associated with it's like the emotional center of the brain, because humans are commonly the ones that have a frontal lobe, and we're the ones with emotions, empathy, those kind of behavioral processes. So Broca's area, like I mentioned, that controls speech and language production. So if your Broca's area is damaged, you may be unable to speak, you may be unable to form sentences or even understand what other people are saying, depending on which part of the Broca's area is damaged. And then there's a primary motor cortex, and this controls more like voluntary movements, so like running and walking. So that correlated in a way to Parkinson's disease, where if you have less dopamine in that part of the brain, it could also lead to like restricted movement. And on the topic of dopamine, the frontal lobe is a pretty like dopamine sensitive area. So like the neurons there are really dependent on like dopamine being produced and being transmitted. So if the neurons in the frontal lobe do not have a lot of dopamine, this can lead to like decreased motivation. And also it plays a really important role in attention, and also it's like the emotional center of your brain. It's what controls your personality, because the cortexes in the frontal lobe help control like your decision making process, and it's like where you process that information. So without it, there's not like you aren't able to show empathy, you aren't able to really like problem solve or really like show those cognitive skills.
Now, moving on to the functions of the occipital lobe, it's mostly known for dealing with different aspects of vision. However, it is involved in other functions. Some examples of these aspects are distance, depth perception, color determination, and object recognition. Any damage to the occipital lobe can lead to several consequences, such as blindness, hallucinations, difficulty locating objects, change in depth perceptions, and much more. In general, the occipital lobe is mainly responsible for interpreting visual stimuli and the processing of information. I mixed up the slides, my bad. So now moving on to the structure. It's located right under the parietal lobe and above the temporal lobe at the very part of the upper brain. It's divided into 2 lobes, one for each hemisphere of the brain. Because there are no structural distinctions in the lobe, it's mostly organized into areas with different functions. These areas are the primary visual cortex, the secondary visual cortex, the lateral geniculate body, the lingula, and the dorsal stream. The primary visual cortex receives sensory information from the retinas of the eye, then transmits that information through the dorsal or ventral stream. The secondary visual cortex kind of just receives the information from the primary visual cortex and just organizes it a little bit more. The lateral geniculate body acts as a sensory relay system and kind of just sends raw information from the outer part of the retinas to the primary visual cortex. The lingula works together with the lateral geniculate body to just create spatial awareness and kind of just give depth to visual information.
Yeah, so after that, there's the parietal lobe, which is located between the occipital lobe and the frontal lobe, as shown in the figure in the blue region. And a really important role of the parietal lobe is to play somatosensory processing, which means that the sensory information from each part of your body was first relayed into your spinal cord, then transmitted to the thalamus. Then eventually these informations in the thalamus will be related into the primary sensory cortex, which will be emitted into the frontal lobe for your decisions or your complex thinking. And anatomically, it's separated from the frontal lobe by the central sulcus right in here between the red region and the blue region. And the inferior part of the parietal lobe is actually a really famous region in brain anatomy called Wernicke's area. And a part of the temporal lobe also has a part of this Wernicke area, which is involved in the comprehension of the language. And also damage to the parietal lobe could trigger some of the really serious deficits in perception of the external stimulus. And several examples including the aphasia and agnosia. Aphasia refers to the inability to comprehend language, which is in particularly if you have some damage to the Wernicke's area, you can speak, but you can't understand what others say. And agnosia is the inability to recognize objects properly, such as when you're holding like a cell phone, like you hold it, but you can't really know what that thing exactly is, and because like you can't really say it or describe it.
So the temporal lobe is the second largest lobe of the brain. It's like in this kind of like, if you're thinking of the brain as a mitt, it's kind of like the thumb part of the brain. and it's considered a pair of lobes, and it crosses both the left and right brain hemispheres. It's located in the forebrain, and it is positioned towards the base of the center of the cortex. It is known as the dynamic organ, which just means that it takes in a lot of information from the other parts of the brain, and it does a lot of kind of, integration of that information and make sure that the rest of the brain has what it needs to do its proper functions. In terms of the function, it is mainly associated with auditory information and memory. There is a dominant temporal lobe, which is involved in understanding language and verbal information. So relating back to what Torres was saying, the Wernicke's area is kind of in that region. There's also the non-dominant temporal lobe, which is related to learning and recalling nonverbal information. And damage to the temporal lobes can cause difficulty in understanding words, identifying of objects, learning, potential shifts in sexual behavior, and emotional disturbances. Again, this is because the temporal lobe takes in a lot of information from different regions, so any damage could result in a numerous amount of symptoms. And now we will be discussing neurodegenerative diseases. So in neurodegenerative diseases, a lot of the two basic or most common brain regions that are involved are the basal ganglia and the substantia nigra, which is a part of the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia is just a group of structures found deep within the cerebral hemispheres. They're kind of connected, not necessarily, but they're all related in one function. They're responsible for motor control, motor learning, emotional behaviors, and are composed of the caudate and lenticular nuclei, the subthalamic nuclei, and the substantia nigra. And all of these are connected in a circuit. And so any damage to one of these nuclei could vastly change the way that the basal ganglia functions. The substantia nigra is called as part of the basal ganglia, and it's called this because if you look at any pictures of it, it looks a little bit darker than the rest of the basal ganglia. And it is composed of the pars compacta and the pars reticulata, and it houses dopaminergic and GABAergic neurons, and it mostly contributes to the regulation of movements. So first we'll talk about Parkinson's disease. So this disease is very, very much connected to the basal ganglia. It is a neurodegenerative progressive disorder that affects nerve cells and impacts patients' movements. So we know if someone has Parkinson's disease, a major symptom of that is tremors. So if that's the first thing that people look at. And if you want to learn more about Parkinson's disease, we are partnered with PCLA. So they're a group of individuals that have it and experience a lot of these symptoms. As I said before, it's linked to the basal ganglia and the substantia nigra. And the effects are that there are decreased levels of dopamine and there's a degeneration, which was caused by the degeneration of dopaminergic neurons. And as a result, it causes an overstimulation of the basal ganglia, which has an inhibitory effect. So basically what happens is that there's increased stimulation of the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia will probably cause GABA or something inhibitory neurotransmitter to be released. And then when you have a lot of these inhibitory transmitters in the system, it decreases the ability for the brain to function. A lot of the symptoms are bradykinesia, so a little slower movement, tremors, rigidity, postural instability, and and can also lead to cognitive impairments as well. Huntington's disease is a rare inherited disease that causes the progressive degeneration of nerve cells in the brain. It is an autonomic dominant related in terms of the genetics of it. So, and most people experience symptoms when they're around 40, which is kind of related to why we haven't actually kind of gotten rid of it in the population. The symptoms appear so late that people have already had kids by then, and they've already passed down that gene to their kids. Which is why a lot of these people do a lot of genetic testing before they choose to have children. It impacts the basal ganglia and the cerebral cortex. It's associated with movement, learning, thinking, and emotions. Symptoms of Huntington's disease are chorea, which is just any involuntary movement, slurred speech, and impaired judgment.
So the Alzheimer's disease is a neurodegenerative disease that primarily affects the normal functioning of cognitive abilities of the brain. And it is a disease that disrupts the communication between neurons, and that will eventually lead to the death of a vast amount of neurons. So the widespread damage of the neurons will eventually lead to symptoms such as memory loss, inability to demonstrate cognitive abilities, such as like doing simple math, and meaningless repetition of words. The parts that the brain is affected by this disease is the disease first destroys the parts of the brain that's involved in memory, and that is the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus. Next, it will affect the cerebral cortex, which is responsible for language, reasoning, and social behavior. And the eventual result for someone with Alzheimer's disease would be the loss of one's ability to live and function independently.
Yeah, so that's it for our presentation on neuroanatomy and neurodegenerative diseases. Now we're going to switch over to our Kahoot. So just give us a second to set that up.
All right.